When the dust settled in August of 1945, the world looked upon a Japan utterly transformed by defeat. The surrender, announced by Emperor Hirohito himself in a voice never before heard by his subjects, marked the definitive end of World War II. This was not just a military loss. It was the collapse of an entire imperial ideology that had propelled the nation into a devastating conflict across Asia and the Pacific. The cities lay in ruins, many incinerated by conventional and atomic bombs, and the Japanese people faced a future of unprecedented uncertainty under foreign occupation. The immediate task for the Allied powers, led by the United States, was to demilitarize and democratize the country to ensure that the aggression that had caused so much suffering would never be repeated. This mission, however, went beyond simple political and social reform. There was a profound and pressing demand for justice, a cry for accountability that echoed from every corner of the vast theater of war. For over a decade, Japan's military expansion had left a trail of immense human suffering. From the invasion of Manchuria in 1931 to the final, desperate battles of 1945, millions of lives, soldiers and civilians alike, had been lost. The stories of brutal massacres, of the inhumane treatment of prisoners of war, and of the systematic exploitation of conquered peoples had shocked the global conscience. The victorious Allies felt a moral and political obligation to address these horrors, not merely as acts of war, but as criminal deeds that violated the fundamental principles of humanity. The question was, how to deliver this justice? How could the world hold an entire nation's leadership accountable for actions of such monumental scale? The answer began to take shape in the Allied decision to conduct formal legal proceedings. This was a novel concept on such a grand stage. The goal was to move beyond the summary executions or political purges that had so often followed wars in the past. Instead, the Allies aimed to establish a public record of the crimes committed, to create a legal precedent for the future, and to demonstrate to the Japanese people and the world that even the highest echelons of power could be held responsible for their decisions. It was a monumental undertaking, fraught with legal and ethical complexities from its very inception. This desire for a reckoning was not just an abstract legal principle, it was deeply personal for millions. Families in China, the Philippines, Korea, Southeast Asia, and across the Allied nations mourned loved ones who had perished under Japanese occupation or in brutal prison camps. The Bataan Death March, the construction of the Burma Railway with forced labor, and countless other atrocities were not just headlines, but lived experiences of unimaginable cruelty. Therefore, putting the architects of this suffering on trial was seen as a necessary step toward closure and a validation of the Allied cause. It was a promise that the immense sacrifices made to win the war would be honored by holding those who started it and who conducted it so brutally to account. The framework for post-war justice was formally established in the Potsdam Declaration of July 1945, where Allied leaders declared that stern justice shall be meted out to all war criminals. Following Japan's surrender, General Douglas MacArthur, as the supreme commander for the Allied powers, was tasked with implementing this directive. He took the decisive step on January 19, 1946, by issuing a special proclamation to establish the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, which would become known as the Tokyo War Crimes Trials. This was not to be a purely American affair. Rather, it was conceived as a multinational effort, reflecting the global nature of the conflict and the diverse nationalities of the victims of Japanese aggression. The international character of the tribunal was its defining feature. A panel of 11 judges was appointed, each one representing a nation that had been at war with Japan. These countries included Media Group, panel of judges at the IMTFE courtroom, judges from United States and United Kingdom at Tokyo, Trials, stock or distribute equally, the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, China, France, the Netherlands, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, and the Philippines. This diverse assembly was meant to lend the proceedings an air of universal legitimacy, suggesting that the crimes being prosecuted were offenses not just against individual states, but against the entire international community. The prosecution team was similarly international, led by American lawyer Joseph B. Keenan, ensuring that the case against Japan's leaders was presented from a collective Allied perspective. The creation of the tribunal was a complex logistical and legal challenge. Its charter was modeled heavily on the Nuremberg Tribunal, which was concurrently trying Nazi leaders in Germany. The Allies had to establish a legal basis for prosecuting actions that, in some cases, had not been explicitly defined as international crimes before the war. The Tokyo Charter laid out the jurisdiction of the court and the specific categories of offenses that could be tried. The former building of the Japanese Ministry of War in Ichigaya, Tokyo, was converted into a courtroom, a symbolic setting where the very leaders who had once planned the war would now face judgment for its consequences. This process of establishing the tribunal was deeply intertwined with the broader objectives of the American-led occupation of Japan. The trials were intended to be a public spectacle of sorts, a grand educational drama for the Japanese people. The proceedings were extensively covered in the press and broadcast on the radio, designed to strip away the mystique and authority of the wartime military and political elite. By methodically presenting evidence of their aggressive plans and the brutal conduct of the war, the Allies hoped to demonstrate the bankruptcy of the old regime and build support for the new democratic order they were attempting to construct. The tribunal was thus both a court of law and a theater of political re-education. The legal foundation of the Tokyo trials rested on a 55-count indictment that categorized the alleged offenses into three broad classes of crimes. These classifications were largely borrowed from the Nuremberg Charter and represented a significant, if controversial, evolution in international law. The first and most novel of these was Class A, Crimes Against Peace. This charge targeted the top-level leaders accused of planning, initiating, and waging a war of aggression in violation of international treaties. The prosecution argued that Japan's leaders had engaged in a long-term conspiracy, beginning as early as 1928, to dominate East Asia and the Pacific through military force, thereby breaking agreements like the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which had outlawed war as an instrument of national policy. The second category, Class B, encompassed conventional war crimes. These were the more traditional violations of the laws and customs of war as established by long-standing international agreements like the Hague and Geneva Conventions. This class of crimes dealt with the misconduct of the war itself, rather than the act of starting it. The indictment included a horrifying list of such offenses. Media Group, Prisoners of War, We Asia, Mistreatment Evidence, Archival photo of POW camps, prosecution evidence photo Tokyo trials, stock, distribute, equally. The murder and mistreatment of prisoners of war, the abuse of civilian populations in occupied territories, the use of forced labor, the plunder of public and private property, and the wanton destruction of cities and towns not justified by military necessity. These charges were supported by overwhelming evidence from across Asia and the Pacific. The third category was Class C, Crimes Against Humanity. This charge was aimed at individuals of any rank who were implicated in the murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation, and other inhumane acts committed against any civilian population before or during the war. It also included persecution on political or racial grounds. While there was significant overlap with Class B crimes, Crimes Against Humanity was a broader concept intended to capture the systematic and widespread nature of the atrocities. It allowed the tribunal to prosecute acts of brutality that were part of a larger, state-sanctioned policy, even if they occurred against a nation's own citizens, though in Tokyo, the focus remained on acts against foreign nationals. Together, these three classes of crimes formed a comprehensive legal net designed to capture the full spectrum of wrongdoing, from the high-level strategic decisions made in Tokyo to the brutal actions carried out by soldiers on the front lines. The indictment was a powerful statement that international law was evolving to hold individuals, not just states, responsible for catastrophic wars and mass atrocities. It asserted a new principle, that following orders was not a sufficient defense when those orders were manifestly illegal and inhumane, and that political and military leaders could not hide behind the shield of state sovereignty to escape personal accountability for their actions. When the trial began in May 1946, 28 high-ranking Japanese military and political figures sat in the defendant's dock. They were the men who, in the eyes of the Allies, represented the embodiment of Japan's aggressive militarism. The list of defendants was carefully curated to include a cross-section of the wartime elite, from prime ministers and cabinet ministers to top generals and admirals. The most prominent figure among them was Hideki Tojo, who had served as prime minister and minister of war during the height of Japan's expansion, including the attack on Pearl Harbor. He quickly became the public face of the trial, a symbol of the regime that the Allies had fought to defeat. The defendants were a who's who of the Showa era's power structure. There was Koki Hirota, a former prime minister and foreign minister, who was charged for his role in the political decisions leading to war and for his failure to stop atrocities like the Nanjing Massacre. Iwano Matsui, the general in command of the forces that captured Nanjing, was also a key defendant, facing direct responsibility for the conduct of his troops. Others included military strategists, ideologues who had promoted the vision of a Japanese-led Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, and bureaucrats who had managed the war economy. Each man represented a different facet of the state machinery that had driven the country to war. The trial itself was a long and arduous process, lasting over 2.5 years. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence, including official government documents, diaries, and the harrowing testimony of witnesses and victims from across Asia. The defense, in turn, argued that Japan had been forced into war by the economic strangulation imposed by Western powers, portraying their actions as a legitimate act of self-defense. They challenged the legal validity of the charges, particularly crimes against peace, arguing that it was ex post facto law, criminalizing actions that were not considered crimes when they were committed. The defendants largely maintained their innocence, presenting themselves as patriots who had acted in the best interests of their country. Ultimately, the tribunal delivered its verdicts in November 1948. Of the 28 men originally indicted, 2 had died during the lengthy trial, and 1 was declared mentally unfit to stand trial. The remaining 25 were all found guilty on 1 or more counts. The sentences varied in severity, reflecting the judge's assessment of each individual's culpability. 7 of the most senior leaders, including Tojo, Hirota, and Matsui, were sentenced to death by hanging. 16 others received life imprisonment, while 2 were given lesser prison terms. These verdicts represented the final, solemn judgment on the men who had led Japan down the path to ruinous war and unspeakable atrocity. No single event cast a darker shadow over the Tokyo trials than the Nanjing Massacre. In late 1937, after capturing the then capital of China, Japanese troops engaged in a 6-week period of just horrific violence. The evidence presented to the tribunal painted a sickening picture of mass executions of captured soldiers, widespread rape of women of all ages, and the random murder of civilians. Witnesses recounted seeing soldiers engage in killing contests and bayoneting practice on live prisoners. The city was looted and burned, leaving a trail of devastation. The prosecution dedicated a significant portion of its case to detailing these events, using survivor testimony, diary entries from Japanese soldiers, and even film footage to document the scale of the horror. The atrocities at Nanjing became a focal point for a crucial legal concept that the tribunal helped to solidify command responsibility. The prosecution argued that senior commanders could be held legally responsible for the crimes committed by their subordinates if they knew, or should have known, about the atrocities and failed to take reasonable steps to prevent them or to punish the perpetrators. This was a critical legal doctrine for prosecuting high-level leaders who may not have personally wielded a sword or pulled a trigger, but who presided over the systems that enabled such brutality. It really shifted the burden of proof, making inaction in the face of widespread crime a criminal offense in itself. General Iwane Matsui, the overall commander of the Japanese forces in the Shanghai-Nanjing area, was a key defendant tried under this principle. His defense argued that he had been ill during much of the massacre, and that the atrocities were committed by out-of-control soldiers in the chaos of a battlefield. However, the prosecution successfully demonstrated that Matsui was aware of the breakdown in discipline and had failed to take effective measures to stop the rampage. The tribunal found him guilty not of ordering the massacre, but of his culpable failure to prevent it. His subsequent death sentence sent a powerful message that commanders could not simply look the other way and escape accountability for the actions of their troops. The concept of command responsibility was applied to other leaders as well, including former Prime Minister Koki Hirota. At the time of the Nanjing Massacre, he was the foreign minister and received detailed reports from his diplomats on the ground about the ongoing atrocities. The prosecution argued that despite knowing what was happening, he did not take sufficient action to compel the military to stop. The tribunal controversially found him guilty and sentenced him to death, making him the only civilian executed as a result of the Tokyo trials. This verdict remains highly debated, but it underscores how seriously the tribunal took the principle that those in positions of authority have a positive duty to prevent and punish war crimes. From the moment the tribunal was conceived, it was shadowed by a persistent and powerful criticism that it was not a forum for impartial justice, but rather an exercise in victor's justice. This argument posits that the trial was a one-sided affair where the winners of the war sat in judgment over the losers, applying legal standards that they themselves were not prepared to be judged by. The judges and prosecutors were all from the Allied nations, and there were no neutral or Japanese representatives on the bench. This inherent imbalance led many, both in Japan and abroad, to question the legitimacy of the proceedings and to view them as a political act cloaked in legal formality. The critique of victor's justice was bolstered by the selective nature of the prosecution. The tribunal's charter limited its jurisdiction to crimes committed by the Axis powers, meaning that any potential war crimes committed by the Allies were off-limits. For example, the massive firebombing of Japanese cities, which killed hundreds of thousands of civilians, was never subject to legal scrutiny. Most controversially, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which caused unprecedented destruction and civilian death, were not considered. The defense lawyers in Tokyo attempted to raise this issue, but the tribunal's president, Sir William Webb of Australia, ruled that the actions of the victors were irrelevant to the guilt or innocence of the accused. This double standard was not lost on observers. Justice Radhabinod Pal of India, one of the 11 judges, wrote a powerful and famous dissenting opinion that challenged the entire legal and moral basis of the trial. He argued that the concept of crimes against peace was an ex post facto law created by the victors, and that the trial was little more than a sham employment of legal process for the satisfaction of a thirst for revenge. He contended that Japan's actions, while deplorable, had to be understood in the context of Western colonialism and economic pressure. While he did not condone the atrocities, he acquitted all the defendants on the legal grounds that the tribunal itself was fundamentally flawed and illegitimate. This perception of victor's justice has had a lasting impact on how the Tokyo trials are remembered, particularly within Japan. For many Japanese conservatives and nationalists, the trial is seen not as a legitimate legal process, but as a humiliating imposition by a foreign occupier. They argue that the defendants were patriots who were unfairly scapegoated, and that the trial was used to impose a guilty verdict on Japan's entire wartime history. This narrative continues to fuel historical debates and political tensions in East Asia today, complicating efforts at reconciliation by casting doubt on the very foundation of post-war accountability and making it difficult to achieve a shared understanding of the past. Perhaps the most significant and debated decision made by the Allies was the choice not to prosecute Emperor Hirohito. As the divine head of state and commander-in-chief of the armed forces, Hirohito was, under Japan's own Meiji constitution, the ultimate authority. He sanctioned the war, and his name was invoked by soldiers as they fought and died across the Pacific. From a purely legal standpoint, a strong case could have been made for his inclusion in the dock, especially under the charge of crimes against peace. Several other Allied nations, including Australia, Britain, and the Soviet Union, initially favored prosecuting him as a war criminal. However, the United States, and specifically General MacArthur, made a pragmatic political calculation to grant the emperor immunity. MacArthur and his advisors in Washington believed that prosecuting the emperor would be profoundly destabilizing. Hirohito was a figure of immense cultural and religious significance to the Japanese people, many of whom still regarded him as a living god. The Americans feared that putting him on trial could provoke widespread resistance, sabotage the occupation, and potentially even lead to a guerrilla insurgency. They decided that retaining the emperor as a symbol of continuity and using his authority to legitimize the occupation's reforms was a more practical path to a peaceful and democratic Japan. To protect the emperor, a careful and deliberate strategy was put in place. Before the trial began, American officials and the defendants' Japanese lawyers worked behind the scenes to coordinate their stories. The narrative they constructed portrayed Hirohito as a reluctant, pacifist monarch who was a virtual prisoner of the military clique that held the real power. The top defendants, including Hideki Tojo, largely went along with this script, taking full responsibility for the war and meticulously avoiding any testimony that might implicate the emperor. This effort successfully shielded Hirohito from prosecution, ensuring he remained on the chrysanthemum throne as a constitutional and purely symbolic monarch. This decision, known as the emperor's non-prosecution, remains one of the most controversial aspects of the post-war settlement. Critics argue that it fundamentally undermined the principle of justice that the trial was supposed to uphold. By exempting the man at the very top of the command structure, the Allies created a hollow center in their quest for accountability. This act of political expediency is seen by many historians as the ultimate example of victor's justice, where political goals trumped legal principles. The decision left a complex and ambiguous legacy, allowing some in Japan to argue that if the emperor was blameless, then the war itself could not have been entirely wrong, a sentiment that continues to complicate Japan's coming to terms with its past. In November 1948, after more than 2 years of testimony and deliberation, the tribunal delivered its final judgments. The sentences were severe for the top leadership. 7 men, including Hideki Tojo, Iwane Matsui, and Koki Hirota, were condemned to death. Their executions were carried out by hanging in December 1948 at Sugamo Prison in Tokyo, bringing a final grim closure to the proceedings for the primary architects of the war. 16 other defendants were sentenced to life imprisonment, and 2 received shorter sentences of 7 and 20 years. For the architects of the Allied occupation, these verdicts represented the successful conclusion of their mission to hold Japan's wartime leaders accountable for their actions and to create a definitive historical record of their crimes. The aftermath of the verdicts in Japan was complex and muted. By the late 1940s, the attention of the United States was shifting away from punishing its former enemy to rebuilding it as a key ally in the emerging Cold War against the Soviet Union. The desire for retribution had waned, replaced by a strategic need for a strong, stable, and friendly Japan. This geopolitical shift led to a surprising degree of leniency in the years that followed. By 1958, all of the convicted war criminals who were still imprisoned had been granted parole and released. This early release of men who had been sentenced to life for orchestrating a devastating war struck many of Japan's former victims as a profound betrayal of justice. The legacy of the convicted leaders became a contentious issue within Japan itself. While many Japanese accepted the verdicts as a just outcome for a disastrous war, a powerful conservative movement began to emerge that viewed the convicted men, particularly the 7 who were executed, as martyrs who had died for their country. In 1978, in a highly controversial move, all 14 of the Class A war criminals who had died in prison or been executed were secretly enshrined at the Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo, a memorial that honors Japan's war dead. This act elevated the convicted war criminals to the status of revered spirits, a move that continues to cause outrage in China and South Korea and remains a major source of diplomatic friction. The fate of the individuals tried in Tokyo thus became deeply entangled in the politics of memory. For the Allied powers, the trials were meant to draw a clear line between the guilty leaders and the innocent Japanese populace. However, the subsequent paroles and the enshrinement at Yasukuni blurred that line considerably. The story of the trials did not end with the verdicts. It continued to evolve as Japan navigated its post-war identity. The convicted men were not simply forgotten figures from a dark past. They became symbols in an ongoing domestic and international struggle over how to remember and interpret the history of World War II in Asia. The Tokyo war crimes trials, despite all their flaws and controversies, left an indelible mark on both Japan and the development of international law. For Japan, the trials were a traumatic but necessary part of the post-war reckoning. They forced a public confrontation with the brutal realities of the war, shattering the militaristic myths that had been so carefully constructed by the old regime. The detailed evidence of atrocities, broadcast and published throughout the country, played a crucial role in discrediting the wartime leadership and fostering support for the pacifist principles that would become enshrined in Japan's new constitution. The trials, in effect, helped lay the groundwork for the nation's transformation into a peaceful and democratic society. On the international stage, the Tokyo trials, alongside the Nuremberg Tribunal, were landmark events in the history of human rights and international justice. They helped to firmly establish the principles that waging a war of aggression is a supreme international crime, and that individuals can be held criminally responsible for state actions. The concept of command responsibility, so central to the convictions of leaders like Matsui, has since become a cornerstone of modern international humanitarian law. These principles laid the foundation for the creation of later tribunals, such as those for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, and ultimately for the establishment of the Permanent International Criminal Court. However, the legacy of the trials is also deeply ambiguous, and its unresolved tensions continue to resonate today. The perception of victors' justice, the selective prosecution, and especially the exemption of Emperor Hirohito have provided ammunition for historical revisionists in Japan, who seek to downplay or deny the country's wartime aggression. This has hindered true reconciliation with its neighbors, particularly China and South Korea, where the memory of Japanese imperialism remains a painful and politically charged issue. The ongoing disputes over history textbooks and visits to the Yasukuni Shrine are direct echoes of the unresolved questions of justice and accountability that surrounded the Tokyo trials. Ultimately, the Tokyo war crimes trials remain a vital, if imperfect, chapter in the global struggle for justice. They remind us that holding powerful leaders accountable for mass atrocity is an incredibly complex and politically fraught endeavor. The trials force us to grapple with difficult questions. Can justice ever be truly impartial in the aftermath of a total war? Where does the line between political pragmatism and legal principle lie? As the world continues to confront conflicts and human rights abuses, the lessons and controversies of Tokyo are more relevant than ever. They serve as a powerful precedent and a cautionary tale, demonstrating both the potential and the pitfalls of pursuing international justice in a world of unequal power.